Hi there, this is Caitlin from Bandy's Books, and I have Jamie from Jamie Kate with me. We have been reading the book Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel the last couple months for the Backlist Book Club. And Jamie, you want to fill everyone in on what that is all about?
Yes, absolutely. We have Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. This was, I actually don't remember when it was written, but pretty recently, actually. But this is a very highly awarded, pretty well loved in the literary community. This is a book following the history of a tiny time period within Henry VIII's life, but this follows one of his advisors, Thomas Cromwell, through his perspective as he kind of works in the Tudor court and kind of moves the chess pieces in this political intrigue story. It's largely revolving Henry VIII and several of his wives at the time. It's obviously very, very dense, very historical, and it takes, I think, what some people would have called a unique perspective on all of the events, and that is Wolf Hall.
Yes. That is a very concise summary. I think it delves into a lot of directions within this book. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, we're also going to mention that we had a little bit of a shift in our scheduling because Jamie got married recently. So we moved our normal schedule around to accommodate wedding shenanigans. But now that all of that is over, we're going to be going back into a regular schedule. So we will be posting a poll tomorrow with books for October. We'll read a book in October, and then from there, we'll go back into a bi-monthly schedule. So November, we'll be picking a book for December. So just keep your eyes out for that if you are interested in joining for the discussion.
Yes, please respond to those polls. We love other people's input so we can all read books that we are all hoping to get to.
Right. So, so back to Wolf Hall. This was, I think, a tough book for both of us, right? I know that I personally really struggled with it. I started trying to read it and just was like, I'm never going to get through this book. So I got an audiobook copy of it and then tried to listen to it. And I don't know if that was any more successful. How about your experience with it?
Yeah, my experience was, sadly much the same as yours, in that this was just, it is a challenging read for so many reasons. The language is difficult, the time period is difficult, the density of the plot, characters, that's all difficult. It's obviously, over 600 pages. And I also did listen, I tried to read some of it and then also did switch to the audiobook. I was intimidated to read this book, but it was one of the ones like everyone loves this book, or at least a lot of people in the literary community adore it. It was very high on the New York Times 100 best books of the century. By the way, I just looked up, and this was written in 2009. I think it placed like third on the New York Times list, which debatable what that how relevant that list is, but it's obviously a book that a lot of people really love, and I was hoping this would be a win because I was like, oh, political intrigue, like kind of, I enjoyed something like Game of Thrones, which also has a lot of characters, also is very dense, also has a lot of moving pieces on the board, but this was not like Game of Thrones.
No, not at all. So I think also what made it really difficult for me too is a lot of the stylistic choices in it. I felt like though it's, anchored in historical fiction, it has a lot of like literary fiction elements that get mixed in that work really well in, I guess, a more literary focused book. But in this particular instance, I felt like it was a hindrance to the actual plot of the story and the things that were going on.
Yeah, for sure.
This book, you're right about the critical acclaim for sure. It won the Booker Prize in 2012, and also I want to say the Book Critics Circle Award in 2012. So it's not just like something that's like a cult classic. It's something that's like received a lot of critical acclaim from, the book institutions and stuff.
Yeah, I think, what I'm always looking for, I'm definitely looking for authors to take risks with their writing style, to, do things that are unusual. But this definitely pushes the limit of what I'm able to deal with stylistically. The language is just, Hilary Mantel just makes it, not so easy to follow along to with like the way that she's not always clear about who is the subject of the sentence, which is very, very confusing.
Right.
Shifting perspectives constantly, characters that change names and titles. And I do get that this is like, based on history, but I think she really wants the reader to put in the work, and I can like definitely respect that. And I'm usually like, I want a challenge. That's why I wanted to love this book. Like I wanted to try this book because I do not want to back down from a challenge.
I agree.
But I was defeated by this book.
I think out of all those different stylistic choices that you mentioned in particular, I really struggled with the lack of usage of names, where things were always like he said and he did, but you're talking about a room full of men. Which he are we talking about here? Thought that got really tedious. I think in our own conversation outside of this video, you and I were talking about it, and I mentioned that like for me, that kind of style might work for, I don't know, 100-page novella where, it's experimental or artsy or whatever. Sure, be literary. Don't give us a name, just he, or she, or whatever. But in this particular book, you're talking about a book that's over 600 pages with hundreds of characters and extremely dense. And so the lack of using names at any point to identify who the subject is or who's talking just makes it overly confusing in my perspective. I also, like you, appreciate risks in literature, and I appreciate when authors try to do things that are different to the genre that they're writing in. But I think that sometimes you also have to think about what the average reader is going to get out of a book. And I feel like this was made overly complex. I didn't, I'm not a history major. I'm not working on my master's in history, in Tudor era history specifically. And so I just don't know that I want to have to put in that much work to get what this book is about.
Yeah, I definitely completely agree. And something that I was thinking about, and honestly, like I did a lot of research about this book, in preparation for this discussion. And just, I was just genuinely curious. I'm like, okay, people love this. And I don't. And that's fine. I don't love a lot of things that people like. So it's fine. I get that. But like, I really want to understand the love for this book. And it's almost like part of me does want to try again someday. Like maybe I just, don't get it right now. Like maybe someday I will. But because I have heard from multiple people that they have said that it takes them like many tries to get through this book. Like they've started, they've stopped it, and like one day it just clicks. I don't know. But what I was going to say was in, thinking about this book, like, and doing research about it, I was wondering if you had previous knowledge of this time period of the Tudor court, would you do better with it? And a couple of people have said like, oh yeah, like, I am a historian of this time period. I do study this. And I don't know how people who don't have that background knowledge would be able to follow this. And I knew nothing about this time period. I do know a little bit about, the only one I'd really heard of was Anne Boleyn, famously. That's the only one I really knew of. So did you have any previous knowledge of this time period?
So, I'm just a humble chef here, so I'm definitely not going to pretend like I'm a history major. And in general, when I read historical fiction, this is a period of time that I tend to avoid like the plague, just because I really don't care about royals and royal courts, and it's just that political intrigue in this particular scenario is not very exciting for me. And I feel like it just gets kind of done to death. So I don't tend to read a lot of it. I do remember basic outlines of this stuff from school. I remember Thomas Cromwell. I remember Henry VIII and killing, executing his wives, and, Catherine and Boleyn and all that. And, just like the very, very basic outlines of it. But I couldn't say that I remember it in any great detail, or that I could, follow every single thing that happened in this book. Like you said earlier, I feel like if I was going to take a really serious crack at it, I would need notebooks, and I would have to sit down and write notes and double back and research. And again, like I'm not doing a master's in history. I'm just a reader. Like if I just don't understand the purpose of making people struggle that hard. Like it feels a little pretentious to me, I guess. Like, oh, my book is so difficult that you have to have a bachelor's in this subject to understand it,
Yeah, this is like definitely one of the most pretentious books I've ever read, which is really saying something because I like go out of my way to find.
I know you like pretentious usually.
I know. I'm like, this is what I'm saying. I'm like, this book makes me feel like so dumb. Like I'm literally not smart enough for this book.
Sorry about the shouting in the background. My dogs were barking at the front door. My mom forgot that we were recording and she's like, hey.
It's okay. We are live, you know? The live things will happen as well.
I'm usually shooting from my house and it's a little bit quieter, but we're in San Diego for the weekend visiting my parents. And so we have 3 dogs and 2 cats all cramped in the house with all 4 of us. Yeah. So it's just a lot of noise.
It's all good.
Anyways, yeah, I was laughing about that because you read a lot of really literary stuff. And honestly, I mean, I read a decent amount of literary fiction too. And I also really like literary, pretentious kind of writing sometimes, but I feel like it has to fit with what you're reading. And I just don't know that it really fit this.
Yeah. I mean, I was like I was saying earlier, I don't know why this didn't work for me unless it was like strictly because of the writing, because like I do think the political intrigue is interesting, and unlike you, actually, I think this period of time, so prior to reading Wolf Hall, I didn't know anything. And I will say that like when I was reading Wolf Hall, I was like, okay, wait, that's kind of interesting. Like, it's interesting. 1 page out of 100 I'll be like, wait, that's kind of interesting. And then I actually, did go up and look up more the actual history of what happened there. And it is crazy. Like what actually happened is like a very like Stranger Than Fiction kind of situation. And I did find that fascinating. It was just like, it was hard to find that momentum amongst so much, like everything they're talking about. They're talking about philosophy and all of the stuff with the church, which to be honest is really over my head. I was trying to like follow along everybody's motivations. So they're like, the story at the core is so interesting to me, but yeah. And then, following Thomas Cromwell too is a tough one, which I was not aware of this, but people like historians or people that do actually like know a lot about this time period, like I think people thought before this book that Thomas Cromwell was kind of the villain of this time period, and that the other character was More, is that his name?
Thomas More, yeah.
Yes, I think it was more than
one of the many Thomases.
Yeah, that who was kind of like more of the, I guess, like the antagonist in this book, was seen as as like a martyr, a hero in in I guess general view of this time period. So I guess that leads like into the next question, just talking about like Thomas Cromwell as a character, as Mantel presents him. Like, is he sympathetic? Did you like him? What do we feel about him?
So I don't know if I found him sympathetic necessarily. I found him relatable or understandable in some points. But I don't really honestly have much sympathy for anybody in this story.
Yeah.
At all. I mean, I think it's like, it humanizes him to a degree. He loses his whole family. He's stuck with this crazy king. There's a lot going on that, you could relate to, but I don't know. Maybe it was just my boredom with the whole book, but I just was like, I don't care.
I mean, honestly, like, right. I mean, like, sympathy for the characters, like justice for the women, like justice for Anne Boleyn, honestly. Like Anne Boleyn, I kind of became obsessed with her since reading this book. But no, I feel the same. I'm like, I think what was weird for me was that with Cromwell specifically, like, I thought that we were going to have this big buildup of how he gets into the system, really, and how I wanted to see that cunning from him, and I wanted to see that like he was making these like big moves, but we get like nothing about the beginning of his life. Like he's exiled from, he leaves after his situation with his father. He leaves his small town, and then just like we learn that he was at one point in the army, but we aren't told that until like later.
Right.
So this like big gap of like he leaves his town, and then all of a sudden he's like a well-educated lawyer, and he's like friends with all these people in power. And that was like kind of disappointing for me, because what I was looking for was like, I wanted to watch him make the big jumps that like get him. It's like, how does this commoner end up in the courts, and like how does he end up so close to royalty, we have a lot of characters asking that question too. And it's like, well, I actually don't know.
Right.
This book is 600 pages. I actually don't know.
And it's interesting where she decided to drop, or where Mantel decided to drop like tons and tons and tons of info, like complete info dumps. But then there's other sections of the book where they completely gloss over like things that you would consider somewhat important. I'm just going to pause for 1 second. We have a couple comments.
Oh, yeah.
Sheila said, "Evening, Caitlin and Jamie. Hello, Sheila. Thank you for stopping in." And she also said, "This book was a little over my head. I didn't get too far into it." Welcome to the club. We were all kind of in that boat for sure. We slogged through it and persevered just because we had to talk about it. But I think pretty universally, we all felt the same way. I was telling Jamie earlier before this chat, my mom started reading it before I did. And I'd get text messages from her like, "Have you started reading Wolf Hall yet? Curious to hear what you think about it. I'm having a hard time with it. I don't get why people like it." And then like a week later, I'm 200 pages into this book and it feels like it's taking forever. So that was kind of like, an inkling for me of what was to come. I just was like, it was almost the same for me. So
I mean, if nothing else, like I am happy to know that like, it wasn't just me. Like a lot of people do feel this way about that, this book. And like, even though it is so well loved, there's also plenty of people who are like, it's just boring. Like I get that she's a good writer. I mean, I definitely see like there's moments where you read a sentence and you're like, dang, that is like a very well put together sentence. Like I love that. You can recognize that it's a well-written book. I guess that's very subjective, but
is it though?
I don't know if I could say it's really well written because I struggled with it, but like I could understand like at the sentence level that she can write.
Sure.
But I don't have to like, I don't have to enjoy the book. Ugh, it's tough. I wanted to. I really did, but
yeah. No, so my mom's actually sitting here at the table and she's like whispering notes over to me. She said that side conversation. So she was saying that she actually knows a lot about this time period and that she's read, other books in this time period and watched TV series and stuff that were set in this time period. And she still didn't like it. So I don't know. Yeah. That kind of makes me question like our theory at the beginning of this, where we were talking about maybe if you knew more about this. I don't know. So Sheila said, "I can read Philippa Gregory, but this one was baffling. I agree with Mom." Yeah. I think I wish there was somebody that was just like, "Yes, I loved this book. It was the best." Here's why. I want somebody to explain to me what the draw was with this. Genuinely. Yeah. I feel like really this is one of those books to me that feels like you get a gold star for reading it. And so people are like, "Oh, I read Wolf Hall and I loved it. It's my new favorite book," because it's like kind of pretentious, right? Like, I don't know. It's like when I finished 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. It's like one of those books where you're just like, this is such like I don't know how to explain it. It's so much going on in this book. It's so challenging and difficult and everything. And so it's like, it feels like when you say like, "Oh, I finished it and I actually liked it and got it." Yeah. It feels like you're like, I deserve a cookie.
Yeah, I definitely scoured BookTube to find some people who did really love it. Are you familiar with Shelly? What is her channel name?
Shelly?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, she loves it. She loves this book. This is her favorite series. She loves all three of them. This is a trilogy, in case anybody did not know. It continues. It goes on. She loves it. So I'm like, dang, maybe we should get her on and be like, hey, what, she actually does have a lot of videos about why she loves it. So it I guess different tastes, but I want to, this might sound crazy, but I'm kind of considering even reading the sequel, even though I didn't like this one, because this one takes place over like the span of, oh my gosh, like a couple decades, like 10, 15 years. But the sequel takes place only over 1 year, and it's specifically about my girl Anne Boleyn, who I'm kind of obsessed with now. So okay. I'm like, that's why I'm like kind of interested in that one, because it still follows Cromwell and it's still from his perspective, and I don't think the writing style changes at all, but I think it's like much more action packed because a lot more stuff happens in like a much shorter period of time.
Sounds like it has a more clear focal point too.
Yeah, and like I think it's just like the drama that I was like itching for. Whereas none of the drama really happens in this book. This is mostly just like set up for the big stuff to come, including the death of Anne Boleyn, which, you know, spoilers for 16th century England, but she is beheaded. And that's really like where the drama is for me. I'm like, because I mean, that whole story is really crazy. And then also what happens after is also really crazy too. So I might read the sequel, but I'm like, don't hold me to that. But it's also much shorter. I think it's like maybe half the size of this. So that also helps. We'll see.
Yeah. So first of all, love Shelly-ish. She's a great channel. I will have to definitely check out her videos on this and maybe listen to her perspective about why she loved it. I feel like, you know, again, like I said, if I have to work so hard to understand the book, I just am probably by default not going to love it. Even if like I went back and reread it and took all the notes and like got more out of it, I just something about a book that makes you work that hard. It's like, I don't know. It's hard for me to really root for a book like that. But I'll be curious to hear if you read the second book, if your perspective changes as you get further into the series. If you read the book, the second book, and you really love it, maybe I'll consider it myself. But as of right now, I'm not really interested in continuing this series.
I mean, if I did, it would not be anytime soon. It would probably be like years from now. And there is a third one, but I don't have any interest in the third one, really. I only am interested in the second one. And even like, I was kind of like, you know, maybe I could have just read the second one instead of reading this one. But
yeah,
I mean, yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, I think that is a part of this that I think about when we talk about books like this that are just so integral to the literary canon of the decades, you know, all the awards, whatever. I think like it's not a personal failing if you don't like this kind of book or, you know, this style. I think it's like, this is a tough book. It is well known to be a very challenging book.
Right.
Yeah. So, hey, props to us for, you know, going for it. Even though, did I retain anything from this book? No. Right. But props to us for attempting it.
I think that was the thing that was hard for me is like in thinking about having a discussion about this book and like looking at, you know, as we were trying to get together, like our book discussion questions, I was reading them going like, oh my gosh, I have to like go back and like refresh on everything because there's so many details and so much that it's like, because I wasn't engrossed in the story, I feel like a lot of those details just kind of went, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I was looking at the discussion questions that are like, you know, floating around the internet. I'm like, wow, I don't even know that I would have the ability to answer that question. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking now to see if there are any that, I mean, these are even some pretty in-depth questions, but yeah, I wanted to talk about, you know, Cromwell's, I guess how he's perceived in this book. And if, I don't know, like one thing I wanted to kind of talk about was, did you characterize Cromwell as like very, like, did you think he was very cunning? Did you think he was like very smart? Or did you think that he was like just going with his heart more, I guess?
I feel like he's kind of a cunning, smart character that's like pulling the strings, or at least trying to. In that comparison to like Game of Thrones, I kind of see him, you know, being like very like trying to orchestrate things within the court, not necessarily as like obvious as some people. And I'm not saying he never stumbles into things accidentally or like has a passion that drives him, but I do think that he's kind of a strategic, like political machinations type of a guy.
Yeah, I think so. I think what was interesting is that I mean, I do agree with that, but I also was expecting, just from like what I thought this book would be, I was expecting it to be like much more exaggerated, I guess. Like I was expecting every single move that he makes to be really, you know, I was expecting him to be like 10 steps ahead of people. It's just the way that I was, you know, thought that people talk about this book. But when I was actually reading it, I did find that like when he would be having conversations with other characters, I was like, okay, he's really trying to like make people comfortable with him, and he's like not giving too much away.
Mhm.
But I didn't really get the sense that he was. I mean, I do think he was pulling the strings in a lot of regards, but I didn't think that he was like way outplaying.
Right. He's not overtly cunning, but that's kind of cunningness in itself, because if you're obvious about your cunningness, then you're not very cunning.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. I think it was just a little different than what I was expecting. I was expecting him to like do like some crazy stuff. And I guess like in a way it is crazy. Anytime that you can get the king, I guess, to do your bidding is interesting, but I also was kind of like it just seemed like he just wanted power for power's sake. Like he didn't seem to actually want any specific thing, I guess. I don't know. I think I was struggling with that a little bit as well.
I can kind of see what you're saying. I think actually I kind of appreciated a bit of that subtlety in his moves. That was like one of the things, like, again, I think it's funny to compare it to Game of Thrones to some degree, but like if you think of a character like Cersei Lannister who's trying to rule everything, right? But she's not subtle enough. Like she's in your face, power hungry. I'm going to control everything, burn the castle down to the ground to like win the war from the person. And that's why she fails eventually, is because she has no subtlety. She doesn't know how to manipulate very effectively. She only knows how to take by force. Whereas I think that's part of what kept Cromwell effective for such a long time, is that he knew the right ears to whisper in. He knew how to work with his king to get things done. He's essentially a politician. You know?
Yeah, much more of a, maybe he's a Littlefinger or Tyrion Lannister.
Yeah.
Which are my favorite types of characters. That's why I was like, oh, I'm here for this. But maybe it was just so slow moving that I was like, we are moving the pieces way too slow for me to even recognize.
Right. There's no intensity to it for sure. I think, like I said, I view him kind of more as like very moving the pieces in the background than someone like Littlefinger, where he's like overtly, like Littlefinger, it's very clear Littlefinger wants power. That's his whole thing. There's no other motivation. Well, I mean, maybe revenge, arguably, but he's very like fickle and unloyal, and he like wherever he thinks he's going to get power, that's his new best friend, right? Whereas I think Varys like is pretty consistent in the background, and that's kind of how I see Cromwell is more.
Yeah. I mean, like, and speaking of loyalty, I mean, I do think Cromwell was actually, he was even more loyal than I was expecting him to be. Like, he had a lot of loyalty to his mentor Wolsey, even when obviously things went very awry there, but he was still loyal. He honestly even had a lot of loyalty to the king, even though the king never had any loyalty to really anybody. So which I think was very, I think that was interesting. I mean, I do think there were moments in the book where you get, Cromwell or other characters thinking about how the king doesn't have, he can't think for himself. He's very irrational, erratic, making, decisions, very, very emotional. But I also think that you have, at the same time, like, they value being close to him, and they value the power that comes with that. So they are loyal to him. And that's just a crazy time period where they really don't have a choice, I guess, but to be loyal to them.
In fairness, you don't want to be caught being disloyal to the king, because then you get your head chopped off, or you get drawn and quartered, or, hanged or whatever.
Yeah, they don't even have to have much proof, as the characters will come to find out later.
Yeah,
not in this book, but so much, but later for sure.
I mean, again, spoiler alert for 1600s history, but I mean, Cromwell ends up getting executed for treason and things down the road, not within the book or anything, so it's not a spoiler for the book, but I mean, he's literally executed at some point. So I mean, again, loyalty is important, and anytime that loyalty can get called into question, it might lead to getting your head lopped off. So
yeah, that's actually what I wanted to. There is a discussion question that one of the questions says, do you know the fate of Cromwell some years after the book's ending? And if you don't, can you surmise it? And if you do, like, does that color your reading of Wolf Hall? I don't know how to, I mean, like, is it really a spoiler? Because this is a history that's been,
No, I don't think it's a spoiler.
But
if it is a spoiler, then maybe, I don't know. Are you like an 8th grader and you haven't taken history yet?
Yeah. I mean, the rest of the series covers the second book covers Anne Boleyn's death, um, beheading, treason, and actually Cromwell pretty much orchestrates her death, which is crazy because in this book they're not friends by any means, but he respects Anne Boleyn a lot, and they work together, and that's crazy. It's crazy to me that he ends up orchestrating her death, which is why I kind of want to read the second one, or at least maybe I should just like watch a documentary or something. But then in the third one, it's about the end of his reign of power,
Right.
which does end in him also being accused of treason and executed, beheaded for that, which what the poetic justice of that. Because after all that he does to all of the women, he does end up facing the wrath of the king himself. And that's, I mean, so I think that's where I'm like, wow, this story is so interesting. And I wanted to like fall in love with this book because of that. But I guess, I could just read a history book. Honestly, I could probably like read a textbook and it would have been more engaging than reading Wolf Hall.
Hey,
So,
I mean, there's always good wiki summaries. Like it's,
yeah.
So to like kind of segue back to the questions, we do know the fate of Cromwell, years after the book's end, right? So I knew that going into it. I don't know if you remembered it going into it. I do feel like it's foreshadowed pretty significantly within the book because if we know anything, we know that Henry VIII likes to lop people's heads off and he's not a super loyal guy. And so it doesn't take much. You just fall out of his favor. And,
Mhm.
I always think kind of like what goes around comes around. So I feel like I could see what was going to happen to Cromwell, through this book. But I also vaguely recalled parts of this history from school at some point. I don't know that it really colored my reading of Wolf Hall, except for the fact that I just was like, okay, I know he's going to get his in the end too. So,
Yeah.
but I don't know that it made it more exciting or did anything for the reading experience for me personally.
Yeah, I actually didn't know when I started this book that
Mhm.
he actually he actually was beheaded for treason for the same or in the same way that other characters were um penalized. But I do think like once I realized that that was, the trajectory of his life, I will say like it did make me think harder about like every decision that Cromwell makes and every move that he does to try to keep himself safe and his allies safe. It's kind of like wow, it's all really for nothing in the end. And I think that there is something that's just it's kind of wild. I said poetic justice. It's just the way that it wraps up is just pretty insane. And I do think that it made me think about that while I was reading it. I was like, wow, all of this like hungry for power, and you know what they say, like when you're vying for that kind of power, when you're
Mhm.
playing a dangerous game, like you're gonna be at risk yourself. So
I think the kids say nowadays F around and find out.
yeah, right, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
um, okay. So we've kind of bounced around on some of these questions. Um, do we want to go back to some of the ones from the beginning and kind of work our way through, or were there
Yeah,
any other
sure.
ones?
If there's any that you think are particularly interesting,
Um,
we
I
can
mean,
work our way through. Sure. Yeah.
yeah, no worries. I'm like, on all my answers are the same, like, eh. So, okay, so our first question was, what does Holbein's portrait capture about Thomas Cromwell's character that even Cromwell himself recognizes? What kind of man is Cromwell? Is he the rapacious in the rapacious world of Wolf Hall? Do you find him a sympathetic character or not? We already talked about that at the beginning, a bit. So, what effect did Cromwell's upbringing have on his character and his latter views about the privileged society that permeates the court? How does he feel about the aristocracy and its insistence on ancient rights?
Yeah. um, I mean, I did get the sense throughout the book that he feels that I I think like he's not from the world of the aristocracy. He is the one. He's the commoner, and that comes up several times. Everyone, his naysayers are like, what? How would this commoner get to this position of power? Which is kind of an interesting. It's an interesting thing. Like he does become a lawyer, and I think that he feels. And again, this is me saying this with not a very strong sense of this book, but I do feel like he feels that, as we all would, they're out of touch and they are, selfish, greedy. And I think like the book is supposed to make him more empathetic. Like I do think that he goes through a lot of stuff. Like his entire family dies in this novel, right. And he kind of has to just like suck it up and just be like, he's faced hard times before. But I don't know if I really know how, where that takes him. Because in the end, he's still going after all the stuff that they're all going after. So I'm like, I don't know.
Right. So, I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. Like we get the picture of Cromwell coming from an abusive family, right? And his father isn't the greatest guy. And he starts to rise to power after being a soldier, but we don't really get much of a picture of what his life is like as a soldier. And then we have, like you said, his family dies from sweating sickness. And then, I don't know. I mean, I guess that beginning stage makes him somewhat sympathetic, like all the crap he goes through, right? But then I just feel like all the political machinations and stuff makes him unsympathetic at a certain point, and then just kind of sticks with me after that. As far as like his views on the court, I think that his views on the court are really shaped by that humble upbringing, that like escaping abuse and being a self-made man, right? He's essentially surrounded by people that are pampered and privileged and that just were born into the right family and got lucky. And meanwhile, he's had to claw his way up through, like from this abusive family all the way through being a soldier and into court. So I absolutely think that his life experience affects the way that he views the people around him. I don't know how it wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with that. But I think I wasn't able to read deeply enough into this book to really like understand how he then made political choices like based on that upbringing. Like, what does he want the future of the country to look like? I was not understanding well enough. I think that part of it.
I agree. I think in general, I struggled a lot with like the details. I got like kind of the general feeling of things, but a lot of the times I was so bored with this book that I really struggled to like grasp any significant detail from the book.
Yeah.
So our next question says, what does Cromwell mean when he tells his son that it's all very well planning what you will do in 6 months, what you will do in a year, but it's no good at all if you don't have a plan for tomorrow?
Yeah, I think this is going back to Cromwell's ambition, and that he's at once he's very he's able to look forward, and he does have a grand plan, he does have a big scheme, but he has to deal with the constantly moving and changing emotions of the people that are right next to him. And I think that it's kind of getting to the discussion of how do you deal with someone as erratic as the king, and how do you move that chess piece while not getting yourself killed.
Right.
Yeah, so
I think too it speaks to like you were saying that the king is very erratic, so you have to have flexibility. But I think also, sometimes in people's pursuit of power, they create like this really long stretching like arc of how they're going to like gain control and all these things, and then they lose sight of the present for the future. So I think he's talking about, maintaining your ability to stay in the moment, which, essentially, helps you to deal with this erratic king, but also keeps you from like losing sight of the forest for the trees.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have, why does Cromwell dislike the Catholic clergy? What are his motives for helping Henry marry Anne Boleyn and sever ties to the Pope? What larger goals does he hope to achieve in helping? Are they Are they selfless or selfish?
Yeah. Now this is where I really was like, okay, my brain has got to start trying to turn on to pay attention to what's going on here, because now I was not taught any of this history in school. I did go to the Tower of London when I was in England, but like that was the extent of like what I knew about this. I had no idea that during this time the Catholic Church like was running things to a degree that then they had to get, like, France was also involved, and also Italy, which that does make sense because of the Pope. But like I would like hearing about the deals with France and like trying to separate the church. Like I know at this time and in the book, they are basically trying to separate the rule and the power of the church from the like government. That's why King Henry VIII wants to get divorced from his wife, and the church won't let him due to religious reasons. And so that's like why they're trying to separate things. But I'm totally lost, really, still as to where Cromwell cares about any of that, other than like the church was pretty kind of ruling with an iron fist over the country, and maybe like he was like, well, that's not very nice. Like, so, but I'm very fuzzy on the details of what had to do with France and everything. I don't know.
So from what I vaguely recall, and again, this is a very vague recollection, so it could be a bit off, but I kind of recall that there was like some sort of conflict, I want to say in like the early 1600s, maybe mid 1600s, where the Catholics went after the Protestants, and there was like a pretty significant amount of atrocities. And I want to say that that kind of shaped Cromwell's motivations towards the Catholic Church. Like it had already kind of biased him against it. And then the desire of divorce by the king, I don't think that Cromwell really gave a shit whether King Henry got divorced or not. I think that that actually just suited his dislike of the church, and he used it as a, hey, let me get you on my side. Like, you're the king. How dare they tell the king what to do? You tell them that you give them permission and you rule things, you know? So he essentially, I think, already had that dislike of the church, and then just kind of allowed the desire for divorce from Catherine and the marriage to Anne to expand his dislike of the church to, you know, more of the politics in England.
Yeah, I mean this is one area that was definitely really fuzzy for me, because I think throughout the entirety of my experience reading this book and like this is where it's just like, this one's on me, because obviously we are in Cromwell's head from page 1, so it should be more clear to me like what specifically like his motivations are, like what he wants out of the power that he gains, like what is he using it for. But to me the entire time, aside from like I guess like a general vague notion of like, oh, it would be good for him if they were able to break up the church, the whole time to me it was more just like they were trying to get this divorce through, and the person that did it was then going to be the king's number one. And that was really, I mean, that is really the central plot of this book, is which of his many different advisors can actually find a way to get this divorce to happen. And I think just because of like that focus, that like very narrow-minded focus for these characters, I was kind of struggling to see like, okay, I'm like, okay, but like, how does this serve you and what you're doing with this power? Like, I mean, Henry, come on, what an asshole.
Yeah, he's not the nicest guy for sure.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly.
Okay, so how does Cromwell perceive Anne Boleyn? How does she come across in this book?
I like Anne Boleyn, and I liked her in this book. I loved how she was so. I mean, she's just so smart. She's so aware. She's as much a player as the men are, and I love that. And I think Cromwell recognized it as well, and he liked having a kind of a worthy, I won't say opponent because they weren't opponents at first.
Right.
They obviously had, they were on the same page. They needed to get this this new marriage to Anne Boleyn through. So they were, working together. And I think he did respect her. I like her. I'm obsessed with her now.
Yeah, I will say I think that she's an interesting character. I think that, there's been a lot of books written about her, and obviously there's a lot of material to explore with her. You mentioned to me, I mean, I knew that this was a series as well, but I didn't really know what the other books were about. And you talked about the second book in this is supposed to focus more on Anne Boleyn specifically. I think that'll probably be a more interesting read because she is, historically an interesting character.
Yeah.
I agree with you that Cromwell, I think, respected her to some degree. She's not like an idiot, and so I'm like losing my thought because I'm just so over this book.
That's fair.
I think that he did respect her to some capacity. Obviously, their relationship turns somewhat contentious at some point, but I don't know that he lost his respect for her, like intellectually and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, and to the flip side of that is that he respected her for a little bit, but like at the end of the day, she was just another means to an end, and he was very, very quick to turn on her too. So I mean, yeah.
But I feel like he's like with a lot of people, like people are kind of disposable on his way to his grand scheme of things. Like I don't see that as being that different than other people in the book either.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So yeah. Cool. I think that covers all the questions that we had pulled up. We've talked about all the stylistic stuff, about the history of it, about how difficult it was of a read. Unfortunately, I feel like this discussion was very, what do I want to say? Like, I much prefer discussions when we're like all happy and enjoyed the book and have a lot to say. Yeah. I feel like this was a hard book. I feel like even if we had really enjoyed it, it'd still be a hard book to discuss just because there's so much to talk about in it. Any final thoughts on it?
I think me being intimidated was justified in this case. I gave it my best shot. It is what it is, They can't all be wins.
No, and I mean, this wasn't the worst loss ever. I've certainly read books that I disliked more than this. There are bones of an interesting story there. I think it was just, I feel like this was like a book written by an academic for academics, if that makes sense. Like, I find sometimes this happens in historical fiction where you get an author that's like obsessed about a subject and they do 10 years of research and then they put it all into a book and they include every single little factoid that they've ever learned. I had a kind of a similar experience reading Booth by Karen something Fowler, I want to say is her last name. And that was about the Lincoln assassination, and it followed the Booth family. And it was like just a massive info dump. And so what I think happens sometimes is you get an author that, like I said, goes down the rabbit hole, learns everything there is to learn about a subject, and then they info dump it into a book and they add a few pretty words to kind of make it into a narrative. And that's kind of what I felt like happened here to some degree, is like there's some pretty writing added in between all of the factoids and all of the information. But I don't know that that always makes a good book. It makes maybe an interesting research tool, but I don't know if it makes it like a great narrative. And I guess that's ultimately what I'm left feeling with this book.
Yeah. I mean, it's very different from the kind of stuff that like you and I typically read. I think, I do love to pick up these crazy challenging literary fiction books every once in a while.
Yeah.
But I think like just in my day-to-day preference, I need something with a faster pace. I need something that keeps me on the edge of my seat. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those things aren't intellectual. It's just, can we find a happy medium between like a popcorn thriller and this? Like, that's what we're looking for.
The thing that's funny is I don't really even enjoy popcorn thrillers. So it's not like I need the book to be super easy and super accessible. Yeah. But again, like I think there's somewhere in between easy accessible and like you have to do research to understand a book.
Right. I have to get a PhD in 16th century England to understand this book.
Yeah. Well, I guess to end this, we will reiterate that tomorrow, October 1st, I will have up a poll for our next pick. Because October is Halloween month, we're going to go with a horror, possibly literary horror type of a book. So I will put up a poll tomorrow morning for that. It's going to be a short running poll just because we're going to be reading this book this month. And then at the end of like 3 days, we'll take the book that won the poll, and that'll be our pick for October. Once October is over, we will be going back to a regular schedule. It'll be bi-monthly. So in November, we'll pick the read for December, and we'll keep going from there in 2025. Wow, it sounds weird saying that.
No, right around the corner.
I know. So it'll be, January for February, March for April, etc. throughout 2025. And hopefully we can keep clearing some books off the backlist. I feel like this has been great for me so far because it's forced me to read a couple books that, have been long on the TBR that I haven't got to. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to see what we pick for October. Let's do something short and scary that will balance out Wolf Hall. But
I'm definitely not planning on putting any 600 plus page books in the list, especially since we have like a 1 month turnaround for this one. I'm going to try to put books that are a little shorter.
Yeah. Yay. All right. Well, good discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah. Thank you for the people that popped in and out. I saw the numbers going up and down quite a bit throughout the conversation. So I know lots of people popped in. Thank you, Sheila, for adding a few comments. I'm sorry that the book did not work out for you. I think, that's generally the consensus for everyone so far. So hopefully October will be a little more successful, a little bit more enjoyable. And thank you so much, everyone, for popping in. And we'll see you real soon with a poll for the next book. And now.